Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tools, the travel company led by reporters around the world. Protesters clogged the streets around Israeli government buildings, demanding Bibi's ouster and a deal to release the hostages. Meanwhile, an American president offers criticism of the operation in Gaza, but the weapons continue to flow. Nothing, it seems, can deter Benjamin Netanyahu from staying his course. But what is that course? Dahlia Scheindlin, our regular expert on Israel, is with us here. Hello and welcome, Dahlia.
Thanks for having me, Nick.
Yeah, good to have you with us. I should say you've got a book that's out. I'm not too sure we've mentioned it before. It's called The Crooked Timber of Democracy in Israel, and you're in the States to promote it. How's it going?
It's going very well, surprisingly, in a way, because this is my second lecture tour in the US since October 7th. And the book came out just a few weeks before, and I've been to, at this point, probably a dozen university campuses between the two trips, in addition to other community forums. And I have to say that I have not experienced, not only has there been no heckling or demonstrating or any sort of the angry confrontations that we've been hearing about in Israel, certainly we've been hearing about them, but all the questions that the participants and students and audiences have raised have been earnest, thoughtful, and none of them have been angry or even particularly challenging or identity-based, I would say. So I've been pleasantly, I wouldn't necessarily say surprised, but it's notable considering that, I think in Israel, certainly people perceive campuses as, swept away by Israel-Palestine fever, and that nobody's debating rationally and nobody's coming to these things with an open mind. That has not been my experience. So
that's a really interesting thing to we might come back to that later. I mean, just from the outset, I think the obvious thing is to say, here we are, 33,000 dead, not to mention those under the rubble, not to mention the fate of the hostages of whom we don't know how many are still alive. God knows what's been happening to them during this time. I want to look at this really in Israeli terms to start with. 6 months on, where are we? Hamas is still in power. As we say, the hostages are still missing. What is the mood within Israel? Can we go through the different sections of society? I know it's very divided, but there must be, Netanyahu himself must be under a huge amount of pressure. He can't be popular.
Well, he is under a huge amount of pressure, and for the majority of Israelis, he is not popular. So you're correct on those. And I also really appreciate that you said, what's the mood in Israel? Walk us through the divisions. Because when people say, what's the mood in Israel? It's hard to come up with a unified mood. There are a couple of things that I would say characterize everybody. And that is pretty fair to say that all of Israeli society is living in a sense of being devastated. And I mean, Jewish citizens, Palestinian citizens, people on the right and the left, nobody is enjoying what's going on. Nobody is happy about it. At best, in the major cities in the center, you can see people living what seems to be a semblance of normal life. Cafes, bars, restaurants are open. But if you look a little bit closer, or if you know the actual rhythms of regular life in Israel, it's not the same. Restaurants and bars are closed earlier or on more nights than they normally would be. And I think just underneath the surface, all the conversations are revolving or eventually going back to this, and it's never good because nobody thinks the war effort is going particularly well. Now, I think that that's where it starts to break down. Other than the general sense of everybody's having a hard time and yet everybody's trying to live as normal a life as possible, the divisions are largely between roughly 2/3 of Israelis who are unhappy with Netanyahu, who would like to have early elections, who would like to see him resign. The only question is whether they would like to see this happen immediately or after the war, leaving aside that nobody knows what after the war means. And about 1/3 of Israelis, primarily among the Jewish population, who basically support him and support his government and support his party. Now, I'm not saying his party has 34% support, or 33 or 34% support, but the basic average of all the questions that would indicate some sort of support for him and his government comes out to about 1/3. And the 2/3 is roughly people who want the government to go and be replaced by a different kind of government. So that's one of the breakdowns. And now, of course, there is a fundamental breakdown so there's a political breakdown. There's a breakdown between Jews and Palestinian citizens or Arab citizens of Israel who have completely opposite views on the war. Yeah. Israeli Jews, I've just seen a new survey saying, should Israel fulfill its part of the UN Security Council resolution calling for a ceasefire? And the majority of Jews say no, but of course, the vast majority of Palestinian citizens Arab citizens of Israel say yes. So this is just one recent example, but every attitude towards the war differs. And then, there are people who are actively on the streets protesting for one of two things. And one of them is people who have been protesting since pretty early on to prioritize hostage release, basically appealing to their own government, spearheaded by families of the hostages and their supporters. But these are very mainstream demonstrations that were big even at an early stage, demanding that their government prioritize the issue and work harder to get to an agreement with Hamas to have those hostages released, even if
I'm sorry. I know there's so many other things to talk about, and we haven't touched the opinions on the right and the Haredim and the religious right and the nationalists, and we'll come on to those in a second because it's important. But I'm surprised in a way that hasn't galvanized more pressure. Just the fact that you've got hundreds of families who have either lost people during the attacks of October the 7th or have got relatives still missing, and you would expect the moral imperative of the government to do everything it can to try and get those people back, yet the response is a military one, and I'm trying to work out how much sympathy there is for those families versus the military imperative to defeat the enemy.
Well, this is the thing. I mean, the government has tried to portray from the beginning to the Israeli public that those two are not in contradiction, and that the military imperative is the means to get a hostage deal, which they argue. The government's argument is that it was only after the first 6 weeks of extreme military bombardment, including the beginning of the ground operation, that forced Hamas to go into the first hostage release deal. And so the government is saying the only way to do that again is to continue with very tough military pressure. However, there are a couple of mitigating factors in reality. In reality, we haven't had a hostage deal since the very beginning of December when the previous one ended. And so December, January, February, March, April, or much of April, part of April, all of that time, the strategy of strong military pressure leading to Hamas to come to terms with what Israel wants for a hostage release deal has not worked. And the other kind of point that detracts from that argument is the fact that the government has actually moved into a third phase of the war where it has been withdrawing forces from Gaza. In fact, we just saw over the last few days the withdrawal of a major battalion, number 98, from Khan Yunis. And right now, there's only one major IDF battalion left in the south of Gaza, and this is in the situation where they're preparing supposedly.
Are you talking about a brigade or a battalion? I think you're talking about a brigade, aren't you?
A brigade, yeah, probably a brigade. I'm not very good at translating these terms. Hativa, if you want to help me translate that. Okay. And so as a result, what we're seeing is that, by one criticism, the government has been doing neither, not continuing the same level of actual military, and the intensity of the first, either the air campaign or the initial stage of much heavier presence of ground troops and ground operations, and not able to reach, a deal with Hamas. And so the government looks frankly incompetent. But when you ask about the moral pressure, I wouldn't be so sure it didn't work, because in the first, couple of months, or let's say until late November, when the first deal was signed, what we saw was a general assumption that the government would not have prioritized the hostages at all. I think, a lot of people who are close to the government and we could see this also in the first few weeks, the government basically wasn't doing anything about that. And there was very intensive pressure by the families and their supporters. It's important to note that these are big demonstrations with lots of regular people who feel, very much like symbiotic with the families. And so it is, there is one argument that says it was primarily because of the very rapid mobilization, largely, by the way, spearheaded by the existing infrastructure of the protests back from 2023, which had organizational capacity in place to help mobilize, that pressured the government into the first one, but that the government wasn't so willing to be pressured and was more prepared to face down the public in the months that followed. And I just want to point out that, on the other hand, in addition to the demonstrations on behalf of the hostages, over the last couple of months, what we've seen is growing demonstrations of proper anti-government. So the hostage support demonstrations were pointedly not anti-government political demonstrations. They were trying very hard to say, we are not against government, we want the government to listen to us. Whereas the anti-government demonstrators are basically saying, we were out on the streets in 2023. We thought you were a destructive, incompetent, extremist government. You have proven yourselves to be destructive, incompetent, and extremist. And we want elections now, or soon, or now. And so those were separate parallel demonstrations, but the anti-government demonstrations have been growing. And the big sort of change from last week, it was a bit of a watershed, was that not this past Saturday, but the previous Saturday evening, which is a traditional night for demonstrating, the two demonstrations joined forces and openly embraced one another, and that made them much bigger. And then they called a 4-day camping out in front of the Knesset, which meant that people flooded into Jerusalem on trains, blocking up the transportation arteries, and that did create a sense of greater pressure. But moral pressure, I'm not sure, because ultimately, when it comes down to it, those demonstrations look a lot like the very same people who were demonstrating in 2023. And what did the government do in response to the demonstrations in 2023? I'll give you one hint. They did not resign. Okay, they were forced to slow down and roll back on the judicial reform plans in 2023. But this is a government that is very well practiced in ignoring that kind of public will, because they see it as driven by supporters of the opposition parties. And they, under Netanyahu, his basic theory is, I don't care about them. They're not my voters.
Do you think it would matter? Does it matter to the government in its current state? We think of it the coalition makeup of the government. Does it matter whether or not there's a deal on the hostages? There hasn't been, obviously, since last year. Do you think it matters in any way that there might not be in the next month, 2 months or so?
Does it matter to the government, to the stability? Yeah,
does it matter? Is it an existential thing? Does it matter the fact that you've got these demonstrations? They're capable of ignoring that pressure, and the war just drags on.
It matters, but it won't. Put it this way: the thing that will be most likely to destabilize the government is if there is a deal. Because if there is a deal, it will have to be voted on by the security cabinet and then the cabinet itself. And it has become a very political issue. I have to tell you that survey research shows it, but we don't need survey research because the government itself, the different parties are divided. In other words, the further right-wing parties, if this isn't clear from the outside, it's the far right parties who are saying, we don't want a hostage deal. And the reason they're saying they don't want a hostage deal is because they don't want a ceasefire. Or they're worried that if there is a ceasefire, it will ultimately mean the end of the war, and they don't want to end the war because what they're communicating is that we need to continue the war to destroy Hamas. And so this has become, a deep political division, and it's reflected in the public as well. The further right wing the Israeli public is, the more they oppose a hostage deal that involves a ceasefire. And the more they're on the center, even the moderate right, center, and left, they're overwhelmingly, and of course, and especially the Arab population in Israel, they're especially supportive of a hostage deal because they want the ceasefire, or at least, let's say, for the middle ground, moderate right, center, and mainstream left Jewish population, they want the hostages back, and they're willing to pay the price of a ceasefire. For the Arab or Palestinian citizens of Israel, they, of course, want the hostages back too, because some of them are hostages also, but they also really want a ceasefire. So it has become deeply politicized, and the government would, very likely have a coalition crisis over any sort of hostage deal the way the terms are shaping up now. Right now, the American government is talking about not a week ceasefire like in November, but 6 to 8 weeks. And so, there's a general wisdom also in Washington that will be the beginning of the end of the war. And so for the Israeli coalition parties of the right, this could be a deal breaker. Some of them might say, we don't want to stay in this coalition. We're going to bolt. So yeah, that's what would destabilize the government. And if you're asking at the moral level, honestly, it's very hard to talk about sort of the level of moral and principles when you have people in government who are operating with a completely different, moral universe. Without even saying this normatively, their considerations of what they consider to be moral are fundamentally different from what we might be talking about when we say morality in terms of the Israeli government doing everything it can to free the hostages. From their perspective, ending the war might be immoral. That's a generous reading.
Okay, so, from their perspective, Netanyahu is their best bet, and they're clinging on, and they're going to be aimed to ensure this coalition lasts as long as possible. There's no way that they can barter and come up with a better solution that's going to suit their needs.
The far right parties?
Yeah.
That is absolutely correct in terms of cold political interest. But remember that 4 of the 5 parties of the original governing coalition before October 7th, right? I'm not talking about the expanded war coalition, but 4 of those 5 parties are ultra-religious or ultra-nationalist messianic religious fanatics. I mean, there's no other way to put it. I try to be objective in my descriptions of these parties, but the ultra orthodox parties have traditionally been in an alliance with the right wing for decades, and these represent a very isolationist community. And for them, securing their interests, which involve of continuing their long-term exemption from the IDF conscription, allowing their education systems to remain fundamentally autonomous, which means they don't have to teach secular subjects and core curriculum, getting funding for those institutions, that is higher priority than anything else. They would break up a coalition if they don't think they can secure it no matter what. I mean, they'll have to calculate, but those are equally important to staying in the coalition. And for the what we call national religious, or what I'm considering the fanatic, messianic parties, it's distinct. You might have thought the first category should be described as fanatic, but I would rather consider them isolationist. Okay. But the second category are ultra-nationalist, proto-fascist. I mean, they're very open about this kind of their basic aims. They want complete power in the hands of the executive. They don't want checks and balances. They want total loyalty to to a single national group as they define it. And they, are frankly prepared to gut most of the institutions of government to be able to advance these plans. And they are annexationists. And for them, annexation is not a political term. It's a religious term. This is a matter of Jewish sovereignty, fulfillment of the word of God. And so they would sacrifice a lot if they think those interests are under threat, including possibly political power. I mean, it's not impossible, even though they're very rational as well. Of course, they would prefer to have political power and stay in the government, I think. But I also think that there's a certain point when anybody trying to observe this has to take into account that they have other considerations that are no less critical in their decision making that involve, messianic and completely cosmological worldview. And if they think Netanyahu is going to stop the war, which involves, ending what is kind of like a holy war for them, or for example, get involved in anything to do with, reviving negotiations for a two-state solution, if there's like pressure for a normalization deal with Saudi, they consider that, a violation of God's will, and they may leave a government even if they have significant power, just to say we can't be part of this. So there are scenarios in which you can imagine them taking down the government, but I think that on balance, right now they won't do it because the polling is so abysmal for the pre-war coalition. The pre-war coalition has lost about a third of its votes in all polls, not in one poll. I never cite just one poll. I'm looking at over 40 polls, if not close to 50, that have been published since October 7th, and they're very consistent. The current government is far from getting a majority. I mean, the original government of those parties and Likud. And so, there is a strong reason right now for them not to bolt. And we'll just have to see. I think that they hope that the more time goes by, the more they will recover, or wait for Israeli society to move further to the right. And then later on, hope that their position improves before actually thinking about taking elections down. That's my best assessment right now. Nobody knows.
I'm very glad that you've gone through all the complexity to this, and it is tricky. I would love to get questions, please, people. So if you can put your questions in the Q&A box, we can put them directly to Dahlia. Just picking up on some of those loose ends that might cause problems within the coalition. I see that the High Court of Justice ordered the state to begin drafting the Haredim and to freeze funds to those religious schools, the yeshivas, that don't cooperate with the draft. How is that playing out?
Well, a week and a half ago, I thought maybe we're actually closer to elections than I realized because of this issue. But so far it's on hold. The Knesset went into recess. The Knesset only reconvenes later in May. And so what we're seeing in the meantime is that some draft notices have gone out, in fact. And I don't know if anybody has complete clarity on whether the funds have actually been frozen. Now, they're not freezing funds to all of the yeshivas, to all of the religious seminaries, only the ones where they know that there are people who are eligible for the draft who have refused to report for the draft. And I think that nobody truly believes that there's going to be like policemen coming to take these people off to be drafted or court-martial them for not being drafted or something, because it just would be such an extreme situation, especially given the sensitivities of what's going on right now. First of all, the fact that there is possibly some breakthrough going on towards the hostage negotiations. The escalation on other fronts is getting very worrying. In fact, as we're speaking, I'm getting a press release from the Minister of Defense telling the American Secretary of Defense that if Iran attacks directly, there will be an appropriate Israeli response, which means Israel is closer than it ever in its history to a direct war with Iran, which has never happened in the history of the two countries. So these are very precarious times, and I don't think anybody expects that drafting a bunch of Haredim who have no skills. Not only do they have no training, they don't even have basic education skills. Nobody believes that the army can all of a sudden absorb all this. It's overstretched already.
Yeah.
There has to be some sort of, there will have to be some sort of framework by law that is reflective of this reality, that it will take a lot to bring them up to identify which ones are actually eligible for the draft and which ones will continue to get an exemption, and how to train them. I mean, nobody ever expected all of the ultra-Orthodox to get drafted who understands the situation in Israel. But it is a destabilizing crisis. It will come up in the next Knesset session, starting in late May, and they'll have to go back to debating some sort of law, unless the government wants to completely absolve itself of the responsibility of making a decision and instead go along and say the court forced us and try to comply.
I'm trying to get a picture of what the direction of the government might be, and it's very difficult. Is your sense that when it comes to actual Gaza, the operations on the ground are being very much led by the IDF, and in terms of what happens the day after, there really isn't much thinking about it, other than some of the statements that Netanyahu has put out about saying that we will be in ultimate control. There's nothing much more precise than that. Yeah.
Netanyahu has steadfastly refused to talk about what he anticipates or envisions or would even prefer for the day after. He sort of tosses out these piecemeal crumbs every so often, saying things like, well, it can't be Hamas in any capacity, and it can't be any actor who, basically with descriptions that clearly apply to Fatah, the governing power in the West Bank, which means he's basically rejecting both of them. And that leaves who? He won't say. He doesn't actually say the IDF should be the only governing power, but that sort of is what's implied by saying nobody else can do it. And he's also, roughly rejected the idea of an international force, although there have been some soundings from the government that there might be an openness to some sort of international force, mostly comprised of Arab states. But this is all very preliminary, and that doesn't seem serious. The prime minister, I think it was in mid-February, that he put out a page-and-a-half document that was supposed to be the day after vision, and many of us were kind of curious, and we thought it was notable that he finally published something about what he plans to do on the day after. But it turns out, once you read the document, which took about 30 seconds, that there was nothing really in it. There just wasn't anything in it. It was kind of a collection of slogans that he'd said before, along the lines of what I just said, and these principles that don't add up to any sort of plan. And there was no way to really tell. In other words, it wasn't really a plan for a day after. It was classic Netanyahu, like, mouth the words, but avoid the substance, and above all else, avoid decision making. And so what we see is that the IDF, there's been some sort of, you could say there was a broad plan, right? It started out with 3 weeks of an air war that was really punishing. Just what many, observers have come to suspect was indiscriminate bombing that killed, I think probably, if I remember correctly, over 10,000 citizen Palestinians, including fighters, but all before the ground operation. And then the ground operation began 3 weeks later, and it started in the north, which was, Hamas's real stronghold. And then, it started with mass, orders of all civilians to evacuate, then the invasion of the north, and then the center and Khan Yunis, and then down to the south, where there has been this ongoing threat of whether to invade Rafah or not. And that's the city where most Palestinians have been displaced to all this time. So you have over 1 million people sheltering, I don't know if it's 1.5 or roughly 1.5 million people, 1.7, who are in Rafah right now. And this is why the American government has been so concerned. The American government has laid down the condition to Israel of saying, we will not back your invasion of Rafah unless you find a solution for protecting the civilians who are there, for evacuating them safely. And Israel has balked at everything. So it's balked at evacuating them safely. It has not put out plans to do so. It says it has plans, but it's not clear what they are. At the same time, there's been this, humanitarian crisis from the beginning. Anyway, so the decisions are being made in terms of operationally what to do, but there is a very strong sense of disconnect between the professional levels of the military and the Minister of Defense, and the political levels of the Prime Minister, and of course the military. The Minister of Defense is part of that, but there's very little sense of guidance from the political levels. Nobody in the top levels of the army is clear what the end game is supposed to be. And, I'm a strategist too, as you have quickly revealed. I'm not a military strategist, but I But I do know that if you want to get somewhere, you have to define the aim in order to plan the steps to get there.
Yeah, Dahlia, I mean, just being a bit blunt, but I think, well, it has to be blunt. I mean, really, it's difficult to see what Israel has achieved, what the IDF has achieved, other than revenge and killing tens of thousands of people. I mean, taking the words of Naum Tibon, the major general who famously rushed to his son's kibbutz near Gaza, single-handedly extracting his family while Hamas was on the rampage. And he says, all talk of dismantling their brigades and battalions is rubbish. They remain a fundamentalist movement that doesn't need for commanders to fight until the death. It's an ideological movement. It's not going to disappear like that. I mean, is there any sense of, other than destroying a huge, in the infrastructure, the homes of tens of hundreds of thousands of people, where's this got, Israel?
Well, I think that it's, a few more things can be true than just the revenge aspect. And I agree that certainly let's break this down, because in the first 24 to 48 to 72 hours, this was not a matter of revenge. Yeah, it may also have been revenge, but it was also a matter of stopping an active, ongoing attack on sovereign territory and protecting civilians on the Israeli side. And I think that that's often missed in the critical discourse, which I share, about how the war has gone. But it would, but in the beginning,
and I get that in the beginning, but here we are 6 months later.
Right. So 6 months later, I think that you can count a lot of the what Israel has achieved militarily in numbers, and I think other people have made this point better than me. You can. The IDF claims that it has killed about 12,000 Hamas fighters. It has destroyed some portion of the tunnels. It has destroyed some of Hamas's biggest, now I'm going to get battalions. I know it is battalions. And on the other hand, there are still 4 major ones left in Rafah. And, the new argument the government is making is that without destroying those 4, you can't claim victory. But Hamas has no doubt been set back militarily. So it has not destroyed the movement. It has not removed Hamas as an actor. Hamas is still in control in Gaza and running the negotiations over the hostages. It has been set back militarily. It's almost an extreme version of what the prime minister used to call mowing the lawn, which was, an Orwellian expression that he developed over the course of the last 15 years. Every time there was an escalation between Israel and Hamas, always triggered by something. But Israel would basically say, Hamas, let them fester. And when they fester too much, we'll cut down the top layer so that they are set back and can't threaten us for another few years. And to be honest, after 2014, it seemed like maybe he had a point, because there was not a significant new war for 7 years. Right in the Middle East, 7 years without a serious escalation is considered a success. And so a lot of Israelis were convinced that Netanyahu had basically made good on his policy. And this, in some ways, I have to say, it looks a lot like an extreme version of cutting the grass when it comes to Israel's military achievements, because there have been some, and Hamas has been set back. But the price, of course, has been 33,000 minus whether it's 10 or 12,000 fighters who are, the question of whether fighters deserve to get killed in war is too philosophical for me. Wars involve the death of combatants, but the civilians, this is a huge number.
It's an unfair question to ask you, but I'm trying to get you're being frank. You're on the very liberal side of Israeli politics, but I'm trying to understand what people think in terms of what's strategically been achieved. Let's bring some questions, and we'll move things on a bit.
Then maybe I should represent people who are not me. What Israeli public thinks is that there's been no choice. This is a war of existential survival and continues to be a war of existential survival. And nobody else understands what it feels like to have had your sovereign territory invaded and your civilians killed. And even if it's not the perfect approach, there is no other way. So if you want me to represent Israelis, that would be a better summary.
That's a good answer. Okay, Alan Livingston, let's have your question, please. Alan, go ahead. Alan in Houston.
Hi, Nicholas. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah. Dahlia, first of all, I read your column all the time, and I really like your comments and the foresight and the ideas that you present. I think it's excellent, and it's very intellectually stimulating. A question on that first is your book tour taking you anywhere near Houston on this trip?
I had a layover in Houston on the way back from Arizona 2 weeks ago.
How long? Oh, you had one, but you're not coming back to Houston, right?
Not just yet. I may have an invitation to come to California later in the year.
Okay, well, I hope so. My question is, would you discuss in more detail the justification for the Israeli strike on the Iranian consulate in Damascus at this time? A number of American journalists have been saying that it was planned to basically bring America more closely into the sport of Israel, possibly into a questionable intervention in Iran. I don't know whether that's just hearsay or whether that has some credibility to it. But also, everyone's waiting for Iran to respond, which they will do, and what that might do in bringing America closer involved in Israel. America says they knew nothing of the strike beforehand and have raised a lot of questions as to why Israel would do the strike at this time.
So I think that the thing to keep in mind is that in the long-term sense, Netanyahu has always been fixated on Iranian power. And let's be honest, Iran is the prime sort of animator of this entire network in the region that has been engaged in this war from the very beginning, and not to mention Hamas itself, which is one of the members of that network. There's sort of a hierarchy of how closely each one is connected to Iran and in what way and how much control Iran has. Hamas is considered one of the more autonomous and it's like kind of its own actor. It's less under control of Hamas, but it has been dependent on Hamas over the years for money, funding, weapons, etc. And the other front, of course, is the northern front. And so what Israel has been, the policy that's been going on for several years, long before the war with Hamas, we call it the campaign between wars, or the shadow war of Israel, bombing, executing hundreds of bombing operations against convoys of weapons that Iran has been shipping, through Syria to Lebanon to get to Hezbollah. And all of that happens. That whole operational network is under, to some extent, under the operation of the Al-Quds forces, which, America, helpfully from Israel's perspective, took out Qasem Soleimani back in early 2020. And Israel has, at various points, targeted what it considers to be key, influential Iranian figures, whether it's nuclear scientists or, top military leaders, although this was a little bit unprecedented. It's unprecedented, but no, of course, we had the assassination of Fakhrizadeh just about a year and a half ago, I guess, in Iran itself. And so it's not unprecedented, but it is, these are select moments when Israel decides it has an opportunity to take out these people who are part of the operational network of managing those forces, managing the weapons transfers, managing the funding, managing whatever operational things are needed to support the entire axis that is supported by Iran. And so I think that, I can't tell you exactly how the intelligence figures made their timing, but probably it's a combination of the usual things that lead to Israel deciding that it can do these kinds of targeted strikes right now. The right intelligence, the right, information, the opportunity that they know they can get.
Charlie, can I jump in? I'm going to be. I don't think this is too cynical to say that Bibi needs the war to continue, and striking an Iranian embassy in another country is definitely escalatory and going to guarantee a continued conflict.
Okay, you're raising a different question when I think that let me try to finish the other question, the other answer, which is like, was this calculated to bring America into it? I mean, I don't know if we know that. America, again, like you said, was claimed that they weren't informed of the timing. And naturally, the timing has to do with Israel trying to, tamp down what it sees as, not just what it sees, what have been physical, engagements in this conflict from the northern border and from various sides, from the Houthis as well. And so Israel, I think, would have probably done this at some point, and the timing was a matter of the opportunism of it. Now, is it also calculated to escalate? I think that there is certainly there are voices inside the Israeli cabinet and the Israeli public, but the Israeli public is not going to the streets for this. But in the cabinet, who have wanted to escalate with Iran, not with Iran directly, but with Hezbollah. And the reason is because they see Hezbollah as armed far more than Hamas. Again, this is not a matter of perception. This is actually, I want to distinguish what is perception and what is reality. Hezbollah possesses exponentially more weaponry than Hamas and can damage Israel much more severely by hitting infrastructure, far inside Israeli sovereign territory and pretty much reaching most of the country. And because their forces had been advancing towards the Israeli northern border, long before October 7th, right? The Radwan forces had crossed the blue line that was established in UN Security Council Resolution 1701 at the end of the 2006 war. Israelis were already jittery about it. There had been some tit for tat sort of escalations or movements and concern, and Hezbollah, having gotten involved on October 8th already, made many Israelis in the cabinet say we have to have an actual war in order to push them back. And I think that it had been, there had been tit for tat firing that has been ever since the beginning. There is a very fine balance, from what I gather of Middle East sources. Hezbollah and Iran don't really want a full-scale escalation, but Israel is trying to assert throughout the Middle East that it is still something like one of the strongest powers in the region, having lost face. Right? I think Israel's very worried, honestly, about being seen as weak, and thinks that we have to always have the upper hand. We have to be taking the initiative, even if we think Israel would like to avoid a full-scale escalation as well. So I think all of that is behind it. And now, to your question about whether it's purely a cynical move to keep Netanyahu in power, there's no question that it would serve him if there was another full-scale war on the Northern Front. It would stretch the entire country to breaking point. Everybody would be engaged in a kind of emergency mentality, right? I mean, Israelis have already been stocking up on food, water, cell phone batteries. There was talk about buying generators last week because it seems so obvious that if there's full-scale escalation, people would be, all sorts of power sources would be knocked out. And so in that situation, nobody would talk about destabilizing the coalitions. Protesters couldn't go out and demand elections, clearly. Having said that, I think it's going a little bit further than I can vouch for, in an evidence-based way. I cannot say that that is the main reason why Netanyahu decided to do that strike right then. I think it was probably much more, a calculation that we can still prove that we have the upper hand on this conflict, and we trust that our intelligence says that Iran won't respond directly in a way that sparks a full-scale war, because they never have. Even after the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, there were strikes. There were strikes on American positions, and of course the main strike on the Saudi oil field.
It's actually Iranian weakness that's being tested.
Exactly. Yeah. And I know that is how the government thinks. How do I know that? Because all of the military analysts who are closest to the government have been saying this is their interpretation. We don't really think Iran will respond directly to Israel. Maybe it'll respond indirectly, or through proxies, or maybe in some other embassy abroad, maybe a year later. So they're getting that from the government. Now, it's not that I trust them to be right, because the government has been so disastrously wrong, but that certainly reflects how the government is thinking.
Okay. We've got a question that throws things forward a bit here, and really to imagine what happens beyond Bibi. So Peter Frey, go ahead, please, Peter.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I can. Perfect. I'm so happy to hear you, Peter.
Hello, Dahlia. So my question is about the reality is that as long as this coalition is in power, nothing in terms of the day after or moving forward can happen. So I'm just curious there's a lot of talk about, the current coalition, they say, is going to be, right now is somewhere around in the low 40s. There's I guess one of my questions for you is Labour Party and Meretz under Yair Golan, who was a hero on October 7th. I'm just curious about how do you see the opposition coalescing? How do you think, and what do you think are the points people should be looking at as like seeing progress?
Just explain who Yair Golan is. We were talking about this earlier, who he is and why people are interested in him.
Yeah, Yair Golan is a former career military man. He was deputy chief of staff, and he actually was sort of pushed out of the position, even though he might have been considered even a candidate for chief of staff at a certain point. Some years ago, I think it was about 7 or 8 years ago, when he started talking about how he was concerned about trends in Israeli society, moving towards, moving away from democratic norms and sort of into authoritarianism that reminded him of the 1930s, which didn't go over well in the Israeli establishment. And since then, since he's left the army, he's become more active in politics. He eventually joined the most liberal-leaning party that is still broadly in the Zionist camp, even though they would define themselves as, Israel should be a Jewish state and a state of all its citizens. So it's certainly the most liberal of those parties, called Meretz. He was an MK, and he is now basically trying to position himself, or he's putting forth his candidacy to run for the head of the Labour Party, whose current leader has formally resigned as leader. She's still serving in the role until there are primaries that will be held, I believe, at the end of May. Peter, you probably remember the date, May 25th, maybe. I think I got a posting about it. But he is now, on October 7th, he, took the initiative to go and join the various forces of the IDF that were scrambling, frankly, to have any sort of coherent response to what was going on. And he was considered a hero for his actions. But I think that there is quite a lot of, how shall I say this, desperate wishful thinking on the part of some of the left-wing constituencies in Israel about Yair Golan personally, and about a sort of lack of understanding about where Israelis will be in terms of the structure of Israeli society and their political opinions. And it's not that I think he's meaningless, but I also don't think he's going to, sweep in and do any better than most of the other left-wing candidates in recent years. And the reason is October 7th, yes, he was considered heroic. He did a great job. He wasn't the only one. As you mentioned already, Noam Tibon, and Israel Ziv. I mean, there were all sorts of figures who have been spending their lives ever since then in television studios, becoming the new great, analysts of everything going on with a certain moral credibility because of what they did on October 7th. He's not the only one who did that. And I also think that before who he's known. In other words, unlike some of the up and coming people who might eventually go into politics, people knew who he was beforehand, and they probably remember that he was, a legislator for this very left-wing party, which, frankly, most Israelis view as radical left. I mean, you have to remember that the Israeli street, the great center or the moderate right, these people consider Meretz to be a radical left-wing party, even though it's far from, there's nothing radical about it, actually. So I think that the structure of Israeli opinion hasn't really changed yet, which is quite interesting. I have not seen the broad self-identification changing very much since October 7th, which is a little surprising. I guess I would have thought more people would identify as right-wing, more left-wingers would have moved to identify themselves as center. It could still happen over the next few years. That's what I've seen during the Second Intifada. But it didn't happen quite yet. But nevertheless, the number of people who identified as left-wing in Israel before October 7th was maybe 18% of the entire population of adults on a good day in surveys, if a good day from a left-wing perspective. And among Israeli Jews, who make up the vast majority of voters, we're talking about 11 to 13%. And that is the combination of moderate left and firm left. And yet Yair Golan, it was with a party that's considered firm left. So I still think that the more likely scenario is that he runs for the head of the Labour Party. Let's say he wins. There might be other competitors. Let's say he manages to bring the two Labour and Meretz together. Then they would be likely to cross the electoral threshold of 3.25%. But I think they have a pretty low ceiling for how high they could possibly go, probably 4, 5, or 6.
So I don't want to get too bogged down on him, because I agree with you. In the way he's a distraction. He's an interesting distraction. But Gantz is the main alternative to Netanyahu, and we've got to talk about the alliance with the United States and U.S. attitudes and the White House attitudes towards this government in a second. I want to come to that. But if Bibi leaves office, what suggestion is there that things are going to change and there's going to be any sense of a new direction? Because Gantz is the guy who's going to step in. What difference would that make?
Oh, I wouldn't be so sure of anything. I mean, Gantz right now, he's leading in all the surveys, right? In most surveys, out of 120 Knesset parliamentary seats, he's getting about, at first he was getting 40 or even 41. So he was taking, a third of the votes. But his numbers are ebbing. Right now, he's only getting about 30, 32, or 34 seats, and that's partly because one faction broke away. But even combined, they're only getting about 34, 35 seats. So he's been losing support lately, and I think it's an interesting indicator that some people who were absolutely horrified by the failures of this government from the right, from Likud, who moved to Gantz, are drifting back. And the same thing from the center, the more moderate center run by Yair Lapid, moved to Gantz and maybe drifting back. We don't know. Gantz is not terribly visionary or charismatic, or he doesn't have great leadership qualities. But to your point, he is leading in all surveys right now. And by all indications, if he were to lead the next government, we'd be, scratching our heads and asking ourselves what he would do, because he is not a man who kind of outlines a long-term vision or a historic understanding of what needs to happen in the long term for Israel. we don't really know where he plans to go on the conflict at large. We have little reason to think that he is any less militant in terms of, I mean, the opposite. He was a career military man. He was chief of staff, and he would probably wage this war. I mean, maybe he would be more cautious on the humanitarian and diplomatic side, but he would probably, and maybe he would be more planned about it. But it's hard to see that he would come up with a fundamentally different military strategy. I think the one thing where he would be more cautious is that he would certainly tone down the extremists he probably wouldn't have the extremists in his government who are demanding full reoccupation of Gaza and building Israeli settlements. I mean, those are major voices within the influential parts of Israeli government right now. And he probably wouldn't have those people in government. He probably wouldn't even consider a permanent reoccupation of Gaza. Certainly wouldn't consider rebuilding settlements, and he certainly would, I think, work harder to show a cooperative, not only attitude but also policies with the American government. He would be probably, much more, he would show much more cooperation and deference, I think, to the American government in that sense than Netanyahu has.
Let's take some of those questions then about that relationship. Let's take Marty Ryan first, and then immediately followed by Vaughan Grills. So Marty, go ahead with your question.
Biden is under a lot of pressure in both directions, from the Democrats, the Republicans, and the Palestinian supporters. So my question to you is purely hypothetical, but what would happen if the U.S. stopped sending military support to Israel?
And let's take, I think it's more of a comment from Vaughan Grills. So Marty's in Connecticut and Vaughan is in London, I think. So go ahead, Vaughan, with your comment. I'm just going to read Vaughan's comment for him. It says, the Israeli government seems to have alienated its greatest benefactor. Go ahead, Vaughan, you're there, go on.
Yeah, the Israeli government seems to have alienated its greatest benefactor, the USA, lost the support of the world, 33,000 dead in Gaza, appears to have forgotten the hostages, and is now provoking serious attacks from Iran, Hezbollah. This is nuts. What the hell is going on? How long can Bibi last?
So let's stay with that premise. The possibility of stopping military aid, Dahlia, it's never going to happen, is it?
No,
I was going to say, I mean, the question is very hypothetical because it's never going to happen, at least not as far as I can tell. Listen, anything is possible. I always have to qualify this. But from every signal I get, I'm getting from any source in Washington that I speak to, the president is very personally committed to Israel, and it will not reach a situation where he stops the flow of arms. Having said that, we are seeing already that the U.S. government has gone further than I think I remember really ever in talking about that, in entertaining the idea of conditioning aid, or even just applying American law, which decrees that America must know that its arms are not being used for egregious violations of human rights or international law or crimes against humanity and things like this. America has regulations on this stuff. There's a national security memo, number 20, which Washington is very concerned about this, and Israelis never heard of it. It's the memo that basically says any country to which you export arms has to prove or document why it's not being used in a way that violates American law. And so these are things that are certainly, I think the pressure within the government comes from the State Department, from the National Security Council, but not from the White House. And so I think that Biden has gone further than certainly than he ever has, in pushing Israel and in saying things and in criticizing Israel's actions, and most recently calling for a ceasefire, and of course abstaining from the UN Security Council vote that allowed the Security Council to pass the resolution calling for a ceasefire and hostage release. But I think that it's a huge gulf to go from there to actually stopping weapons transfers. Certainly not any way that's going to really affect or constrain Israeli actions. Now, I can say that Canada, for example, just a couple of weeks ago, decided to stop exporting arms. And I think that, Israel is concerned about that. And Israel is concerned about other allies that might stop exporting arms. Of course, but America is the biggest source. And so I just don't think it's going to happen now. If every other country that exports arms to Israel would suddenly stop overnight, maybe that would have an impact. But that's also pretty far from being in play. If America were to shut off the faucet completely overnight, yes, it would severely constrain what Israel can do. But it's very hypothetical. And in terms of, sorry. I was going to try to address the next question, but the next question was basically what the hell's going on? I mean, if you piece together the things you just said, about why it looks like Israel's doing things that are self-defeating, what's going on. I'm not going to justify it because my first critique, and it's not only my critique, is that there hasn't been a sufficient strategy. And the strategy is not clear other than that Netanyahu, either is cynically trying to stay in power and keep the war going, or truly believes that the only way to achieve anything is to just do as much damage, physical damage to Hamas, even if you give up on the idea of routing them as an ideological movement, which we all agree is almost impossible. So just do as much physical damage as possible until you absolutely have to stop. It's very, scattershot, aimless and brainless maybe, but it's bull in the china shop, not exactly out of character for how Israel has responded militarily in the past, just less strategic. And how long can Bibi last? No serious analyst in Israel is willing to bet when elections will be held. The only thing I can say is based on historic precedent. Historic precedent for 75 years shows that very few governments in Israel have lasted a full 4 years, no matter whether it was war or peace. So that is it's almost a given that most governments fall before their term is actually out. I can safely say there is likelihood of this government falling before 2026. But can I say that it will fall by September when Benny Gantz, the member of the war cabinet who was in the opposition but then joined to become part of the war coalition, he called for elections to be held in September. I have very little guarantee that they will be held in September. It could happen if the crisis, for example, over the drafting of the ultra-Orthodox, heats up again, if they start actually enforcing the draft and the ultra-Orthodox parties say, we're not staying in this government, you've betrayed us, or if the government tries to pass an actual law that the Haredim don't like or something, or doesn't pass a law, and then, even the Likud will split over that because there are divided attitudes within the Likud. So there are various crises that could tear the government down, very likely. I mean, last week I wrote in my column that the seismographic needle about whether there will be elections soon went up, but it didn't go over the line. It's just it's all word games, right? It could happen that elections are called next month, and it could not happen. And then they could go on, the government can limp along like this, especially if there's an escalation on the northern border or with Iran. I imagine the war will be stretched out, that the government will be stretched out further. So it could go on for another year like this. And when you say how long can Netanyahu last, because what Israel's doing seems to be self-defeating and boxing itself into an unsustainable corner, until there's a legal mechanism to get, to call early elections, unless there's a military coup, which I don't see in the cards right now, he will stay in office. And that legal mechanism involves a majority of the parliamentarians voting to disband the Knesset. There could also be a vote of no confidence, what we call a constructive vote of no confidence, in which the government reconstitutes itself in a different coalition formation. And if that were to happen, it's another way he might end up not being in office, but that seems far-fetched right now because there's no agreement about who would be. I mean, under the current coalition and under the current Knesset breakdown, his loyalists still have a majority. And if 5 members of Likud were to break off, because just to remind people, 64 seats out of 120. That's what the original government had pre-war. So if to be defeated in or for a vote of no confidence, even if it's constructive, or a vote to disband the Knesset to pass, you would need 5 defectors, right? So there'd be a majority of people voting for the no confidence or for the disbanding the Knesset. 5 people would have to defect from the government or from the Likud, which is where everybody's anticipating they might come from, failing one of the other coalition parties bolting. And until that happens, he stays in power.
It seems very clear to me, Hamas committed war crimes. Israel has committed war crimes. Thus far, both of them are completely impervious to those accusations. But the accusation that Israel is starving Gaza and creating a famine has now become a widespread one. And it would seem to me that might change. There does seem to be more of an attempt by Israel to let in some food, or maybe that's just a result of the military scale of operations just to, being reduced. How do you see that? Do you get a sense that Israel's giving in to some of that pressure?
I think that Israel has been put under significant pressure. And, for a number of people keep trying to ask me, why is the Israeli government now complying? I think the international pressure has been a big part of it. I think that it would be very hard for me to read into their minds and see if they care care about the fact that there are hundreds of thousands, over nearly 2 million civilians who are certainly living in abject conditions that are untenable, and they all are at risk of hunger, and that hundreds of thousands of them in the north are at risk of starvation. So I don't know if there's any moral aspect to it, but I suspect there's also a bit of self-interest, not only in terms of the room for diplomatic maneuver, right, because it is really starting to cause severe pressure from Israel's allies, but also public health crisis in Gaza will affect Israel too, right? It always does. And you cannot, people need to internalize that no matter how high a wall you build, there is no such thing as hermetically sealing Gaza, especially not with, whatever forces the IDF has in there, and internationals going in and out, and trucks going in and out, even if there's 10 or 500. So, public health crisis in Gaza will mean rampant disease, including infectious diseases, including mass pollution that will clog up Israel's own aquifers and water treatment plants. It's happened before. Everybody who works in public health or environmental infrastructure knows this, and I assume the Army knows it too, because the Army, its arm called the Coordinator for Government Activities in the Territories, is what runs this stuff. So there has to be awareness inside the government that this is also bad for Israel, but it does highlight that the fate of the two populations ultimately is inseparable and interdependent. They will have to be coordinating policy on some of these stuff, and I think that's probably feeding into it. But I think primarily the international and diplomatic pressure. And just to say, it's not exactly like the current level of admittedly boosted numbers of trucks and aid entering Gaza, right? There's somewhere between 400 and 500 from sources on the ground. It sounds more like 400. From the Army, it sounds like 500. The sources on the ground also say some of the trucks are half full, but never mind. There is an effort to get more aid into Gaza. It's not nearly enough because it has to do with distribution, right? It has to do with, with whether Hamas is stealing it or not. Because, of course they are, right? We know that too. Hamas is certainly plundering it, and also has responsibility for whether there are safe conditions for distributing it. So, there are a lot of bad actors involved here, but Israel is in control of the crossings. It has recently said it would open the northern crossing from Erez, which is a start, but it's also not a cargo checkpoint. It's not really built for that. I think it's not going to be a game changer. That, the amount and the distribution and the safety of the distribution is the bigger part of this. But more than anything, it requires a ceasefire to really begin ameliorating the humanitarian crisis. It just can't be done without that. It will always be piecemeal.
Dahlia, thank you very much. This has been a very comprehensive discussion. I think we could carry on for some time. Just tell us what you're doing next. You're in the States for another week or so?
Yeah, I'm in the States for about another week and a half. I'll be doing a panel event at Barnard for anybody who's in the New York area. On Sunday this week, Sunday afternoon, I'll be doing an event at Dartmouth University next week on the 18th. I'm not sure if that's public, but it's on the campus. I have various Zoom events in between, and then I'll be back in the region at the end of April.
And your book, The Crooked Timber of Democracy in Israel, that was, this looks at the, do you describe it?
Yeah, it looks at the long-term history. I call it the whole Megillah for anybody who knows something about Jewish holidays. It's the whole picture of the evolution of how democracy was conceptualized from the early Zionist movement through to the establishment of statehood, and continuing on every decade through about June 2023, when I had to finally close the proofs and send it off to the publisher. So I include the current crisis, which began roughly on January 4th, 2023, when the government announced a series of plans to undermine and eviscerate the independence of the Israeli judiciary. Now, I had already finished my first draft of the book before the elections of November 2022, because that crisis had been extremely prominent in Israeli political discourse and policy and rhetoric and legislation, or attempted legislation, for at least a decade, and I had been tracking it closely. And when I eventually came to realize that the assault on the Israeli judiciary was a mere, like the tip of the iceberg, with a huge, sort of underwater web of complications about how Israel has always felt about democracy. And I wanted to tell the story about how the foundations were established in a way that included the potential for democracy, but was always missing such significant pillars that Israel was either unable to fulfill or unwilling to build a true democracy, although it did develop very piecemeal significant democratic institutions, democratic practice, that makes it a complicated picture, and really explain the roots of why the whole structure of democracy was so unstable and missing these pillars that brought us to a situation where half the country voted for a government that wanted to undermine democracy. Why did that happen? And this was obvious to me before the elections because it had been going on already. And I think I'm only realizing after the book was published. Well, no, I'm only realizing throughout 2022, while I was still finishing, 2023, the year of the major protests, how many Israelis were not paying attention to what I considered to be the biggest, and most alarming development of the second decade of the 2000s, which was the assault on the judiciary. Most Israelis, I guess they weren't paying attention, or they thought it was secondary, or they thought it wasn't serious, and they just were blindsided in 2023. And so I think that the book really, without meaning to, ultimately is answering the questions of 2023. Why is this happening? Why did people vote for this government? Why do many people support undermining the judiciary, and with it, a semblance of constitutional order? Why are people actually fundamentally vulnerable in Israel? What does it mean that Israel has been, in some form, practicing martial law, military rule, undemocratic authoritarian military rule for all of its history? Because in the first 20 years, it was practicing that kind of regime against its own citizens, even though they weren't actually citizens because of a technicality, but not a technicality because everything is important. Never
Arab
mind.
Israelis we're talking about. So Palestinians.
I'm talking about Arab citizens of Israel. And then, even as that regime was being dismantled, Israel began the occupation of the West Bank, Gaza. What does it mean for the very same regime, the same arms of the state, all branches of government, to be engaged in those undemocratic practices while simultaneously, purporting to build democratic institutions and practices for their own citizens, and in some ways succeeding? If it hadn't been somewhat successful, we wouldn't have the freedom to even think about these things.
And there's a sociological element to that as well, isn't there? If you've got a military and martial society, I think that fits into that as well.
Well, there are many aspects, there are many threads that I tried to hold together. And believe me, there were many times when I thought I was not suited to the task because I'm already ADD, and so is the book, and so is Democracy in Israel. But I hope I tried to, tell the story in a way that seems to me coherent. On some level improvement, on other levels constant deterioration or lack of foundations to begin with, and how those led us to where we are today, which I do see as a coherent picture, even if it's a complicated picture.
Who publishes the book?
De Gruyter. It's an academic press. Go for the paperback. It's the only affordable option.
Dahlia, thank you very much. It's been very good.